Open your Bibles to Luke, chapter 22. This will probably be the last message this year. Not the last message, it's Greek to me, but the last message concerning what happened those last 24 hours before Jesus went to the cross. I've been preaching on that for several years now. I was hoping to spend more time on it this year, but was not able to, so we'll pick it up again next year around the same time. But our verses tonight will begin with verse 47, Luke chapter 22. 47 reads, "And while he yet spake, behold a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him." This is in the Garden of Gethsemane. "But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" That's probably a whole other message, if not next year, before this particular series is done on this last 24 hours. "When they which were about him saw what would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? And one of them smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear." Now you can read the story in Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, and John chapter 18. It's always good to read the story in all four Gospels to get a full detail understanding of what happened that evening. And one of them smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus answered and said, Suffer ye thus far? And he touched his ear and healed him. Basically, Peter, out of God's will, decided to take matters in his own hands. And even though he consulted with Jesus, he didn't wait for the answer, and he decided to take off, I think originally, hit this man's head. But he got his ear instead. So what does Jesus have to do? He had to clean up the mess. Have you ever had a time in your life where you were brokenhearted to see maybe a loved one, a friend, or maybe an acquaintance make a mess out of their life? I'm sure if you live long enough, you'll come across someone that just breaks your heart because you know, because obviously you had some personal contact with this person, what a mess they made out of their lives. And because you love this person, or you hold this person's dear to your heart, you're willing to do anything necessary to help this person out, to assist this person to get their life back in order again. There's probably people listening to me tonight that have done that for family members. Although you knew the journey would be difficult, you would nonetheless be willing to take on their chaos and their disorder and confusion that they created to help those people, because you knew they would never get out of the mess that they found themselves in by themselves. It's not that much different from what I'm reading to you tonight in the scriptures. Let's see what Jesus did for hothead Peter in the garden that night. Peter sliced off that ear of the high priest's assistant, Malchus, Malchus. He was the servant of the high priest, or the assistant of the high priest. I think there's an example here. There's so many different takeaways from the story. I cannot possibly give you all of them in one evening. But there's an example here that Jesus gave us that night. If you think about what Peter did to this assistant of the high priest, I've already mentioned it was out of God's will. No doubt about it. If he, instead of sleeping, was praying as Jesus requested, maybe he would have been in God's will, and you understand the purpose of about ready to happen to Jesus. But that didn't happen. He was out of God's will, but not just out of God's will, he is also against the law. What he did was a crime, and that crime would be punishable. There's no getting around that. It was going to be a punishable crime, maybe even punishable by death. We might not think that way because we know the whole story, but Peter's action was criminal. His action was sufficient enough to ruin his entire remaining life. He injured physically. The way the courts back then would see it, a fellow citizen. And this was just not any old citizen. This was Malchus, the assistant of the high priest. This was somebody that was well known among the community, definitely around the city of Jerusalem. It was just not a nobody. There's no doubt about it. He would have been imprisoned. Because obviously Malchus wouldn't have died by losing his ear, but he still would have been imprisoned for injuring a person, a fellow citizen, and a fellow citizen with a high stature in that city. Now, prior to that, Jesus was sweating blood, involved in intense spiritual struggle and battle and warfare that he fought in the garden, by the way, while Peter was asleep. Then here comes the mob, Judas leading the way, betraying Judas. And as Judas approaches Jesus, he kisses him, the kiss of betrayal, from supposedly a disciple, a friend. Knowing that he was facing the cross, and you have to spend 3 days in the grave. Now, because of Peter's actions, here comes another problem thrust upon Jesus. Like, that wasn't enough to deal with. Peter had to go and create more problems. Because of his out of line, unauthorized behavior, what did Jesus do? It's quite clear, we'll get to it here in a second, what he had to do. He had to put everything on hold. For that moment. Why? So he could fix the mess that Peter got himself into. The mess that Peter created. Put flesh and blood in this story. I know it's just a few verses, you could read right by it. But try to get into the scene that evening. The blood pouring down from Malchus' head, probably blood dripping from the blade of the sword that Peter was holding. What did Jesus do? Verse 51, let's read it again. And Jesus answered and said, Suffer ye thus far. Suffer ye thus far. Highlight those 4 words. That's how the King James reads it. Suffer ye thus far. This was like saying, if we would say something like that today, let me just do one more thing before I go with you. He's telling the temple guard, all the Roman soldiers, suffer ye this far. Let me just do one thing before you take me away to eventually crucify me. And he didn't, but that's not what he said, but you know the story. And then what did Jesus do after that? And he touched his ear and healed him. He could have been taken away, said nothing, and I guarantee you Peter would have been arrested, imprisoned, and probably executed if Jesus didn't stop the entire process to fix the huge mess Peter created that night. The scripture says in verse 51, Jesus touched his ear. He touched the servant. Put the first word up. The Greek word for touch is haptomai. It means firmly grasping someone or holding someone tightly, or someone or something tightly. Haptomai. Now I think this is important because it lets us know that Jesus didn't just lightly touch the servant of the high priest, Malchus. He firmly grabbed Malchus' head and held him tightly. Why this is important? Because it lets us know the tenacity in which Jesus prayed. When he laid hands on people, you knew it if you were the one he laid hands on. Now, in the scriptures, it doesn't tell us whether Jesus picked up the ear that was sliced off, or maybe he grew a new ear. Or maybe, like I said, he grabbed the old ear that probably fell from the ground and he miraculously set it back in place on his head and healed Malchus. It doesn't matter how it happened, how this miracle occurred. The word haptomai lets us know that Jesus was aggressive in the way he touched this man. Just imagine, he's out there and he's aggressively. I mean, Malchus was probably in a lot of pain. Everyone else is recovering from falling backwards because of Jesus pronouncing who he was. part of that. And here's Jesus. Imagine the soldiers around the temple guard saying, should we do something? Look how tight and firm and aggressive Jesus is to Malchus. He's trying to finish him off. No. Now those soldiers were smart. They just got a rude awakening what Jesus' power was like. They let him continue until Jesus was done healing this individual in this story. And it says, Malchus was healed, and he healed him. He was completely healed. Now the Greek word there, put up the next screen. The Greek word there for healed is iaomai. Iaomai. It means to cure, to restore, or to heal. Jesus completely restored Malchus' ear. And I said this last time. It was the last recorded healing Jesus did before going to the cross. He restored the ear of Malchus before the soldiers bound him up and took him away. Before they let him out of the garden. Remember, I just mentioned it. In that garden that evening, Jesus knocked down 300 to 600 soldiers off their feet to get their attention, and they landed flat on their backs. You think he needed Peter's help? No, he didn't need Peter's help. Did he request Peter's help? No, he did not request Peter's help. He didn't need Peter to intervene in any way. It didn't matter. Peter suddenly jumped in the middle of God's business, if you want to call it that. And what was Peter trying to do? He was trying to cause a revolt. And after seeing once again the power that Jesus demonstrated knocking down those soldiers, he felt invincible. But that was not part of God's plan. But Peter could have left, Jesus could have left Peter there. Obviously, he was going to be in prison also. He could have walked off and left the huge mess that Peter created and done nothing about it. He could have said, hey, Peter, you messed up and this is all you're doing. Own it. He didn't. What did Jesus do? He stopped everything that was happening. That's why he said, suffer ye thus far. He stopped everything that he was doing. And he intervened on Peter's behalf. Jesus took the time to heal Malchus. You probably come up with several reasons. I think first and foremost, because he's a healer. He's a healer. And the second reason, because he didn't want Peter arrested. He didn't want Peter taken away because of his impulsive actions. No. He did it for two reasons. Because he's a healing God. And that's why I wonder what happened to Malchus. His name in Hebrew means to become royalty. And maybe he did. God knows if any Roman soldiers had a change of mind after what they saw that evening. Jesus stopped to help a beloved friend. Jesus stopped to help a beloved disciple. Jesus gave his life for everyone, friend or not, disciple or not? Makes me to stop to think and evaluate myself. The next time I think I'm too busy or maybe too important to get involved in someone's problem. This is a good example to fall back on. And what happened that night 2,000 years ago. That night Jesus had plenty on his plate. He had a lot on his mind. But he still stopped everything to help Peter, his beloved disciple, his beloved friend. Now, I already said it. He could have told Peter, Peter, you messed up. This is all on you. You have to own it. You have to fix this all on your own. But he didn't. He didn't. Jesus knew, and it was clear, there's no way he would have got out of this trouble without Jesus' assistance. There's no way. So what did Jesus do? He stepped in to help Peter to get things back in order again. We're good at messing things up. Now, I get tempted sometimes to be very judgmental. I preach to me first. And if you get anything out of it, then, that's wonderful. But there's been times that I'm tempted to be judgmental about other people's self-imposed problems. But I remember the many times that God's mercy has intervened on my behalf in the messy situations that I created myself. Obviously not as drastic as what Peter did that night, but still a mess that I created. And I probably deserve to get in trouble for it. But you know what? Jesus still loves me enough to come right alongside me and help me pull things together. And he guides me out of the mess. I've seen it happen more than once in my lifetime. So now, when I read these stories, I see it as example. When I see others in trouble, now, somebody can abuse your graciousness. And you have to be careful and wise in dealing with those situations. But when you see others in trouble, you have the opportunity to be an extension of God's mercy to them. Like I said, there's so many takeaways from this story that night. I'm just putting the feelers out in one perspective that I see and how I could relate it to me and what I've done, what I've got involved in, what I got myself in, how Jesus has been there for me, and I'm an ambassador, and therefore I'm an extension of him, and how I could provide mercy and help someone else get out of trouble. If it's the appropriate thing to do at the time. There's not a doubt in my mind that Peter created a huge problem for himself. And maybe the other disciples would have been affected by it also that were there that night. It maybe even extended even to the disciples that were not there. Without Jesus' assistance, Peter would never get out of the mess he created. I repeat, Jesus had to put things back in order, and that's what he did. It's easy to be judgmental about other people's problems. Boy, are we champions at judging. I find myself at times where I have to remind myself, as I said the many times, that God's mercy has intervened and saved me from my self-imposed problems. When I read this story, and when I consider Jesus' attitude towards those who are undeserving, how does it affect my attitude towards others who find themselves in some kind of self-made trouble? I pray I get to a place in my life, remember I'm preaching to myself, where I see, when I read this story, how I've been touched by the Lord's mercy. So judgment and condemnation cannot operate inside of me. Towards others that created their own messes. God on so many occasions has helped me get out of some serious messes, folks, that I created. I hope that whenever I see others in trouble, maybe that's an opportunity, like I said earlier, to be an extension of God's mercy to them. Jesus, not just in this story, by the way. We're just focusing on the story at this moment. Always extending himself out for the benefit of others. Not to mention what he did at the cross. And what he did before he even got to the cross. What he allowed himself to be put through. He could call legions of angels down and wiped out this world. But he didn't. And like I said, I can't be all things to everyone. And you got to evaluate situation for situation. But if I can be of help to people that are in need, and the abilities that God gave me to do so, I pray that I will be always able to step up and be that extension of God's mercy to those in need. Now, this is a different kind of message. This is a different kind of passage you're hearing tonight. You usually don't see that side of me. But this story brings it out of me to share with you. I'm not saying to be a whipping boy for all these people's problems that you might run into. Like I said, you have to use discretion. And most of you that listen to me are grounded in the Word, or will become grounded in the Word if you listen long enough, to know how to distinguish through prayer and guidance of how to be that extension of God's mercy to the ones that need it. The last thing that I ever want to develop is a hard, cold heart. Because if I do, I have no business sitting here and preaching to you or anyone else. May God grant my prayer and put me in a place where I need to be a useful ambassador to Him, to serve His purposes, whatever they may be, to show off His love and His mercy, and how wonderful it is to a world that needs it desperately. And it's a world that's gone insane, and it's a world that's heading to destruction. And the only way it's going to be even saved for a millennium is His only begotten Son coming back to rule and reign. And guess who's going to be there with Him? Ruling and reigning also. Us. So let's learn some of these lessons now, because we got a big job ahead of us, folks, whether you want to realize it or not. We're in training for whatever He has as an assignment for us in the next 1,000 years when that starts. And I believe it's coming very soon. To be His extension of what He wants to accomplish. Now, until next year with this series on this last 24 hours of Jesus before the cross, I'll finish here. Now I want to hear from you. Play the song.